Started. Thank you all for being here. I know it's a late afternoon, but I appreciate you being here nonetheless. Today on the agenda we have Senate Bill 47. Senator Gooch is going to present that bill, and it's just going to be a hearing only, and then we probably will bring that bill back up for a vote at possibly our next meeting. So Senator Gooch, would you like to come forward and present Senate Bill 47?
You want to sit at this table right here? Is this good?
Either that or the podium.
We'll bring Hannah up here also. This suits you, Mr. Chairman?
That'll work.
I just left a transportation meeting downstairs, so I was in a hurry to get up here. Let's see this bill. Make sure we got the right number. Thanks for having the hearing on this today. It's an important piece of legislation that we passed last year. You may recall, I think Senator Unterman had it in the Senate last year, and I'm not sure if it got held up in the House for trouble or just ran out of time because of the pandemic issues we were dealing with. But as you know, IEPs are already eligible under the Special Needs Scholarship in Georgia. We currently fund those scholarships for students that have an IEP through their school systems. This bill would expand that, just like it did last year, to allow students with a 501 or 504 plan to be eligible as well. And you'll see in the bill those are conditions that are spelled out specifically on lines, actually it's in section 2 on lines 90, starting at lines 93 through 118. So those conditions that are spelled out there, formal diagnosis from a licensed physician or psychologist for a Section 504 plan with one of those conditions that are spelled out there, they would be eligible for that state funding. So the most of the rest of the language in the changes in the bill are simple housekeeping changes, just a small changes here and there, but we have a couple of folks here that want to testify about the details and the need for the change in the legislation, and I'd love to let them talk first.
That'd be
through
fine.
those details, and then we can come back and
Yes,
take
sir. We
questions
go ahead and
if
do that.
suits you. Thank you.
Please give your name.
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, for your time today. My name is Hannah Heck, and I'm an attorney and a mother to 4 children, including our oldest son, Teddy, who has Down syndrome. And one of many things that I was surprised about on the day that my son was born was that I was welcomed into a group of advocates on that day. And it's been a great joy of mine to get to connect with parents, caregivers of children with special needs over the last several years in my work with a number of organizations, including the American Federation for Children. And I would love, certainly I can speak to some of the details of the legislation, but they really come from the stories and the conversations that we've had with those parents about a program, the Georgia Special Needs Scholarship, or the SB 10 waiver, that's been on the books for about 14 years, serves about 5,000 students across the state. And, as Senator Gooch mentioned, one of the pieces of this legislation would extend that to students who have a 504 plan alone. And that was the mirrors the language that was in Senate Bill 386 last year. And one of the things we've heard, we heard from a mother out of Gainesville, for example, who her daughter had a 504 plan to accommodate her sensory processing disorder, auditory processing, dysgraphia, dyslexia, ADHD, and anxiety. The mother was pursuing an IEP, and that really got derailed because of COVID. They kept pushing back that date on which she could get that, and she didn't think her daughter could wait to have the services that she needed. And so she explored this program and realized that she was not eligible, and I think that was a big surprise because she knew her daughter was somebody who had special needs. And it was pretty great how the school was able to come around and provide her with financial aid for this year. The mother works 2 jobs. She would not be able to afford that without that financial aid. But she's just one of many examples of students who are in this situation where they would clearly fall under what we think of as special needs and the original intent of the legislation, which was based on Florida's McKay Scholarship. And Florida has since, for a decade, changed their program to also allow students with 504 plans. So this would be consistent with what others have done in this arena, and recognizing that these students need alternatives and options when something that works for most students is not working for that particular student. And I'm happy to answer questions, or I can go through some of the details of some of the more in the weeds changes as well.
Any questions? Yeah. Yes, sir. Go
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is for the senator.
Yes, sir.
Senator, when I look at line 108, it says emotional or behavioral disorder.
Yes, sir.
Can you be a little bit more, is there a descriptive term or descriptive language for emotional or behavior disorder, or is that going to be defined by the doctor?
I think you would leave that up to the professionals whenever they're diagnosed by the licensed physician or the psychiatrist or psychologist. I don't know if that's defined in any other section of the code or not, but to qualify for the 504, you would have those restrictions for that. Senator Dolezal points out line 95.
I
which
say
guess
that.
starts at 93 through the diagnosis of the doctors, which shall be identified by the State Board of Education for the purposes of this code section.
My question is, does the State Board of Education have a descriptive term for emotional or behavioral disorder? In your opinion?
I would let them answer that question, but I would
Okay.
assume so, yes,
I can clarify.
please.
The emotional and behavioral disorders in the current law. Under the list of disabilities that students need to have to qualify. And so it mirrors the language in the existing statute.
Okay. Further questions, Mr. Chairman, if I may?
Yes.
How many people do you think this bill would reach? Is there a number of potential people that will qualify for this if we should pass this bill?
There's probably a number, that number changes obviously, but roughly there's 5,000 students across our state and over 130 school districts that access the program today. That's about 2.6% of the students that are eligible and less than 0.3% of the total public school population. So is there a number on the 504s? I don't have that number in front of me. Do you have that? Hannah?
There was data published in 2018 estimating there's about 1.62% of Georgia public school students that have a 504 alone. So compare that with approximately 12% of students that have an IEP, 11-12%. So significantly less than are eligible for the scholarship under the current statute.
Okay. But this will be an additional 1.2%.
That would be eligible. So granted, of those 12%, 2% of the 12% actually participate, or whatever that ends up being, 2.5%. And so it would be, the 1.65% eligible, but likely much lower participation of that percentage.
Okay.
Senator Parent.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm not sure who to, actually, I'll ask. Is it Miss Heck or Miss Hecht?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry. I have a question. So we're, obviously, state and local budgets are still in a rough patch. We cut a lot of money from the public schools last year. We put some back in, not all. Would you support, you'll recall from last year, I'm sure, that I felt like the bill was really overly broad. But my question is, would you support means testing this program?
As you know, that the current program is not means tested, and I think there's quite a few programs that service students with special needs that aren't means tested, like the Katie Beckett waiver, a number of programs under DBHDD I think part of the logic in that is that it's difficult to understand kind of the impact on a family when you're looking at someone who has complex, needs coming from a variety of sources. So, I mean, that's not a direct answer, but I think I would just like
Yeah.
that there's
I mean, I guess what, if I can follow up a little bit, certainly some of the conditions that you list, I think that would be true. And obviously, that's true of the Katie Beckett waiver. I mean, that's a totally different thing. But when you're talking about like ADHD, I'm not sure I agree that that would fall in the same type category as, complex. I do not call that a complex disorder myself. So then that gets into more, since many children, especially male children, of which I have two, from families that sort of have the means and abilities to get what makes schooling possibly slightly more difficult for boys in general under the age of 12, say. I don't, you may remember last year, I just have an issue with like the notion that my family would all of a sudden be eligible for all this money over 17 years. And I just find that totally inappropriate, which is why I was, wanting to ask the question about means testing it. So you do not support means testing it?
I think it would be complex to try to understand what would be the appropriate, how would you divide by based on what the complexity was of what a student is dealing with and the other external cost and what that, how that should grade it.
Well, okay, so then let me
I'm
ask.
not aware of another state, but I'd be open to looking at.
Well, then let me ask you this: why should ADHD be in there?
Well, I mean, I can tell you, I've talked to a lot of parents who have students with ADHD, and they're struggling with where they are. They're not being well served, and so kind of the premise behind just the basic, scholarship in and of itself is that when you have a student who has those extenuating learning challenges, that there's an option for them if where they are is not working. And I think the vast majority of students are well served in their current situation, including my son. And but it's when it's not working, what are those opportunities to provide the education that the student needs?
Can I ask one more, Mr. Chairman, of
Yes,
the
one
author?
more.
So I'm going to ask you the same question, Senator. Given our current education funding crisis, would you support means testing it?
No, I would not. And let me just give you a personal perspective on this as well. My son was diagnosed when he was in the first or second grade. We had trouble, my wife and I, with him as a student, trying to keep up with his homework and having a hard time paying attention in class. He wasn't a behavioral problem, but the teachers would call us and say, we're having trouble with your son. We'd love for you to come in and have a teacher-parent conference. So we did that for about a year, and it became repetitive with all the teachers, and we finally felt like we needed to take him to a doctor, and we did. And so he was diagnosed. The school system where I live did the best they could, but he struggled for several years, and he was medicated for that diagnosis. And when he got to the 8th grade, he was having such severe impacts and side effects from it. He just decided on his own to quit taking the medication. So he struggled through the rest of middle school and then through high school. He was an honor student. He maintained pretty much a 4.0 GPA through his whole middle school and through high school. And today he's a senior. He's about to graduate from high school in May, and he'll be going to the University of North Georgia for the first year. He wants to continue that at Georgia Tech through aeronautical engineering. I say all that to say that he has basically dealt with this issue on his own. His mother and I have had a difficult time trying to help him because we didn't have the financial resources to take him to a private school in Atlanta because it was so far to drive. And there's probably not a school close by that we could have taken him to. Even if this scholarship had been available at the time, we probably would not have been able to exercise that opportunity. But I would sure hate to keep that opportunity from existing for other parents that did have the opportunity to do that. There's not a lot any of us wouldn't do for our children. And just because it's taken money from the public school system, in my opinion, should not be the reason to not pass a legislation like this. I think it's very important that we help our students, our own children. I think this is the right thing to do, regardless of the financial ability of someone to be able to pay. Some of you on this committee and some of you in this Senate chamber probably take your children to private schools, and you may have the financial ability to pay for that. For whatever reason, you choose to take your child to a private school. A lot of people back where I live can't do that. The average household income in North Georgia is probably $50,000 or less a year. And so I think regardless of your financial ability, I think we should make this opportunity available to all of our students. And it's been a struggle for our family. It's been a struggle for my son, but he's learning to cope with it. But the public school system has not provided the tools that I believe that are available in other places that could help him with that struggle. So no, I would not support the means testing on this.
All right, Senator Sims.
Is there a representative, thank you, Mr. Chairman, but is there a representative from the State Board of Ed here? Nobody? I wanted to ask, oh, okay, didn't see you, Matt. Yes, oh, there you are. What would the statement on line 93, the student has a formal diagnosis from a licensed physician or psychologist or a Section 504 plan relating to one or more conditions that are included among the conditions which shall be identified by the State Board of Education shall be. So this extra cost burden would fall on the school district is to verify that the student has any of these specialities.
Essentially, like the state board would determine whether they had these particular specialties. I mean, the way it's outlined here, it looks like that you would have a formal diagnosis from a licensed physician or psychologist. So, I mean, I don't know how, other than if it's a formal diagnosis, what that specification would be. I would say that, you know, as it relates to the 504 plans, you know, I heard the committee talking earlier about 504s. We know that from our numbers, there are about 58,000 504 students in Georgia. That, again, when you compare it to, I guess, the broader number, but the requirements for 504 versus IEP are certainly a little different in terms of the requirements for the school district and the determination of the services provided to the system and the stringency of such services. I think another question would be on line 117 as it relates to rare diseases identified by the National Institutes of Health, Genetic and Rare Diseases Information Centers list. I know that from our team, after reviewing that particular site, that you know, that the site itself mentions that, you know, the diseases listed there don't necessarily serve as official recognition by the NIH as a rare disease. So as it relates to the State Board of Education, I would say that they would probably have concern related to, you know, specifically that section of identifying a rare disease that was on the site, but that they would have to verify as so.
Thank you so much.
Senator Dozell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of questions, Senator Gooch and Ms. Heck, if it's okay with you, Mr. Chair. Can you walk us through the process of currently what it looks like to get a 504 classification or designation for a student? I think that if I understand the previous question correctly, it was maybe a little bit of, it was asking if the State Board of Education conducts that analysis. How does that currently work?
Well, for me and my family, it was, we were asked to come in, talk to the teacher. The teacher thought, and the counselors thought, that this was something that my son could be diagnosed with, and they instructed us to go to our pediatrician at the time. So we did that on our own at our own cost. The school had no responsibility for the cost of it. They did participate in the survey and portion of it with the doctor. They were in consultation with one another, and so they filled out the paperwork and submitted that to the doctor, and my son was tested. I imagine that would be different for each one of these conditions, obviously. Cancer is different than ADD, obviously, so I imagine that the school system has a role in that, consulting with the professionals in the healthcare industry, so they would be able to diagnose this student for that purpose. And you may want to give a more broad answer than that.
Certainly. The, Section 504, to get a 504 plan, DOE has extensive guidance that they issue to schools on kind of the process in terms of following both the federal requirements for protections for the student under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and then just practically in terms of moving through the process, like a parent going to the school administration and what they're asking for in terms of accommodations and services. And so that would be, I mean, the process is school specific with guidance from DOE on how to go about that.
Great. The scholarship that you're proposing to attach to the special needs scholarship, that's calculated as a QBE equivalent. Is that correct?
Correct.
So the notion that we would be spending that money for 17 years, what happens if a student stays in the system for 17 years in a public school? Is it not true that we're paying that money?
Absolutely.
And that this is literally a zero-sum game, whether if the student stays in the school for 2 years or 7, if they're a junior in high school, or the full 17. Is there a difference between the allocation, the spending by the state, whether they're in public school or whether they were to take advantage of the scholarship?
I'm assuming that it's the same allocation because it would be the FTE equivalent. You're not using any of your local school money, for example, ad valorem taxes and so forth. It would be the school funding from the state.
So taking your son as an example, your son received an FTE, and I'm not sure what county you live in, but in whatever county you were in, the state allocated that funding.
That's correct.
The locals also spent their local money.
That's correct.
And that's about a 50-40 and then 10% Fed split. So in reality, when your son stayed in the district, it cost the locals more money
Absolutely.
than had your son left and received his state allocation. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
And you want to dialogue on this? You're coming out of your chair.
It isn't the same amount of money. The reason I mentioned the 17 years is it locks in at the kindergarten rate, which is more money because of the student teacher ratios. So the state actually pays less for high schoolers as they go along. But under this bill, the higher amount would lock in with the child the whole time.
So do you all have, on the 5,000 students, do you all have statistics of how many of them under SB 10 receive that funding as a kindergartner versus somewhere else in their education journey?
I don't know what grade. I know that the vast majority are elementary school that participate in the program, and then there's significantly less in middle and high school. And they,
I want to just, if you don't mind if I stop there. So what happens? In other words, you're saying that more of them participate in elementary school, less in middle school and high school. Are they coming back into public school? Are they leaving the state? Are they, what's happening what's the drop off there?
So there's a lot of different scenarios. So for example, there are some schools that are set up to only be, for a few years and then to transition them elsewhere. And so in that case, they're transitioning either to and back into their public school or to another educational setting that's not covered by the scholarship.
Oh, I was gonna, if no one else has their light on, I did want to ask, thank you, Mr. Chairman, what, I think we touched on this earlier, but do you have the rough numbers? And if you don't, maybe the school system does, how many kids have a 504 plan in each of these categories, like currently?
I don't know based on categories.
Okay, Tiffany, do you guys know?
I don't have them offhand, sorry, based on the categories.
Do you have a round number? Overall, well, either.
She had the overall.
Right, overall, 58,000 students.
58,000? Okay, thank
Well, I'm not sure, I don't know that number, but I don't know if that includes students who also have IEPs, because a student can have a 504 and an IEP. I don't know that.
That one we categorize separately from IEPs.
Okay.
Okay, now we're all confused. So what's the number of children we're talking about?
Students with just 504 plans was a little over 58,000. I have to get the IEP number for you, but I can get that for you in a moment.
A little less than 200,000.
200,000 with IEPs. And right now, we have 5,000 children in SB 10.
What was the second number for IEPs?
200,000.
Roughly 200,000 currently in IEP.
Senator Brass.
Turn me off.
Well, I was just trying to crunch some math over here, and I feel like I might qualify for this now. But
Me too, brother, me too.
so the number you had said earlier, Ms. Heck, that there were 5,000 currently receiving SSO. Is that number accurate?
Yes, for the special needs scholarship, 5,200.
For the special, there's 5,000, and you said of 5,000, 12% are eligible. Is that number accurate? 12%?
12% of, and these are rough numbers, but roughly 12% of the 1.7 million students in Georgia are eligible because they have an IEP.
Okay. All right, so that comes out, so 12% is about, well, I did it at 1.6 million. That's 192,000 eligible. So 5,000 are current. So that's roughly 2.5%. And so of that 58,000, we're talking about 1,450 kids.
If it was the same uptake rate. And then granted, this is a 14-year-old program.
Right.
So it's grown to 5,000 over 14 years.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I was just crunching at 2.5%, 58,000. That's 1,450. So that's how many if it, you know, that might be double, might end up at 2,900. But just to kind of put some numbers out there, I mean, to put it in perspective, I mean, 2,900 out of 1.6, 1.7 million kids ain't a whole lot.
2,900.
Yes, sir. 58,000 times 2.5%. Or if you did it times 5%, you're talking about 2,900 kids. Thank you.
Senator Parent.
So I don't, now we're having a little discussion. I don't dispute your math. What I think, though, you're sort of glossing over is the fact that this program is much more broad than SB 10. So I don't think we can at all assume that the uptake rate would be similar.
Well, that was why I added in the fact that it might double. So if you double the percent, you end up with 2,900 kids out of that 58,000.
I mean, well,
I was just trying to put some numbers, put it all in perspective, is all I'm trying to do. Trying to get my head around this whole thing.
All right. Let's go ahead and we have some people signed up. Oh, Mr. Tippins.
I'd like to ask DOE a question, Ms. Taylor. Come forward. Currently, under SB 10, is it not true that all of those students had a very clear medical diagnosis?
So they certainly had an IEP under SB 10. Now we do include medical waivers for students that had separate medical diagnoses, so that they wouldn't have to meet the time frame of the full IEP process. But under current SB 10, it's for IEP students.
but to be accepted as a SB 10 student, they have to have a medical condition as one of the ones that's specified in the list. Is that correct?
As specified in the list are allowable by IDEA for IEPs.
Okay. I just think, have we got a fiscal note on this bill?
No, we have not.
In terms of potential liabilities on it?
We can get one.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, I just think, I know we're casting a lot broader net, whatever the final number is. It's gonna be, even if it's just 58,000 potential, I mean, that's 11.5 times what's currently in the program. If you're looking at 12% of 1.7 million students, that's exponentially much wider net. I think we need to think about the logistics of that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I will say this, 504 is a much lower standard of admission than what we currently have, obviously.
Senator Innovatardi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. I just want to, first, Senator Gooch, thank you for bringing this bill. On a personal level, I get it. My brother had an IEP and had attention deficit disorder when we were growing up at Chamblee High School in DeKalb County in the 90s. And at that point in time, Chamblee was probably top 3 ranked high school academically in the entire state and the country. And during that time, there was no solve for special needs students or kids with attention issues. And as a school board member, former school board member, one of the challenges I saw locally before I came into this role is we keep putting bandages on stuff, but we don't want to do a bigger solve. And I want to at least applaud you and the folks who've been working on this to kind of at least try to move the needle. I get funding is everything to some people, but in this day and age where parents are desperately trying to find flexibility for their families, where a student may not be served well in their situation, or may not have access to the services they need in that community, or access is an issue where, you know, whether you're in the mountains or West Georgia and I'm having to travel 60, 70, 80 miles to, you know, get help because I can't get the help I need in my own backyard because, you know, whether we're a community in poverty or some other issue, we're going to have to build these, I think, these flexible, you know, flexibilities into our system, I think, in order to help families. So I get the budget issue. I've seen it. I've lived it at the local level. My family dealt with it growing up. Having to get, you know, notices from doctors and argue with the school district and argue with the principals, like, I get it. But at some point, I think we got to move the ball forward. And if my colleagues here or anybody in the General Assembly wants to have a bigger discussion on how do we address a lot of the issues special needs families are dealing with and overhaul the whole system, then let's have that conversation. Which, you know, we can definitely talk about budget and money and where those things go. But I think for now, where we're at, I think, you know, the results have shown that this, I think, for the most part, I get where Senator Parent is going. At least in my backyard, in West Georgia, I think we've seen where this scholarship has been helpful to families over the last 14 years, you know, since its inception. And I think a gradual movement forward, I think, in helping more families is the right thing to do. So I just want to thank you, Senator Goose, for coming here today.
Thank you.
All right, we've got some signed up to speak to this. Lisa Morgan from Georgia Association of Educators. Please state your name and where you're from.
Good afternoon. My name is Lisa Morgan, and I am the current president of the Georgia Association of Educators. I am a classroom teacher in DeKalb County. I'm currently on leave. I have taught in DeKalb County Public Schools for the last 19 years. This is not my first time standing before you, but it is my first time standing as president of GAE. I want to tell you about my experience cleaning out my classroom this summer, because as GAE president, I serve full-time, and I'm not with my students daily. And I teared up and began to cry as I packed up my classroom. My friend who was there with me looked at me and he said, "Lisa, stop crying. You've spent the last 19 years every day fighting for the 24 children in your classroom. You no longer have 24. You have 1.8 million students now." And I didn't really believe him then, but now I do. There are 1.8 million students in our public schools. 96% of the children in this state attend Georgia public schools. And I would like to challenge you to take that mantra on as well, that each and every one of those students is your student, and we must provide for all of our students. It sounds good that we're going to have 58,000 more students in the program, but we would not have 58,000 more students in the program. The schools that participate in the current program are in 54 of Georgia's counties. That's less than half of our counties that have a school that participates in the program. 23 of those 54 counties have one school. So the remaining counties in Georgia have no option. They do not have a chance to participate in this program because most of the children, most of the families in those rural counties that have no school participating also probably don't have the wherewithal to get their child to a neighboring county. The average scholarship we currently give is $6,743. The average tuition at one of these schools is $14,847. Once again, less than half. We spend $35 million each year on this program for a small number of students, while the remainder of the 1.8 million students in our public schools have experienced cuts. And I've heard, well, we got CARES Act money this year, so it really wasn't a cut. But the CARES Act money was very targeted and was intended for the unexpected expenses that came with COVID-19. The average daily expenses, the things that we have been providing under QBE, and which, let's be honest, we haven't been providing everything our schools need because QBE is in the 1980s formula. And if you talk to any educator, any classroom teacher, ask them how much they spend out of their own pocket every year. I'll tell you, my first year teaching, I spent the equivalent of 1 month of my salary on supplies for my classroom. And educators do it every day because we are there for our students. Georgia's public schools are just that, our public schools. And they exist for all 1.8 million students. Am I saying our schools are perfect? No. But I do know that my colleagues across this state work every day to ensure the very best for all of our students, because each and every one, when they walk in the classroom, they become ours. They become a piece of our heart. They become our babies. Please, let's focus on the 1.8 million, all of our students, and not a small minority. Thank you.
Thank you. Gretchen Walton, Cobb County Schools.
You need your phone, Miss Moore. Yes, good evening, Chairman Bain, members of the committee. I'm Gretchen Walton, and I'm the Compliance and Legislative Affairs Officer for Cobb County Schools. A couple jobs ago, I was the 504 coordinator for Cobb County Schools. I'm also the mother of an adult son who has ADHD and is now a proudly serving the Air Force. First, I'd like to broadly respond to this bill and offer some insight into 504 and IEPs, and then I'd like to offer some more specific concerns to the actual language in the bill. What is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973? It provided the first civil rights protections for people with disabilities. It was and is an anti-discrimination law. Do private schools provide Section 504 plans? No. Section 504 only applies to schools that receive federal funding. So unless a private school takes public dollars, they do not have to provide 504 plans. What exactly is the difference between an IEP and a 504 plan? Well, to be eligible to have an IEP, students must have a documented disability and need specialized instruction. The rules and regulations around eligibility are rigorous and include specific roles that must be fulfilled to even hold an eligibility meeting. In contrast, the bar is much lower for 504 students. While an IEP provides specialized instruction, a 504 provides disciplinary protections in public schools, and 504 plans provide accommodations to the same instruction as all other students. For example, a 504 plan might give a student extra time to finish an assignment. So you're being asked to potentially double the special needs voucher program for students who do not need specialized instruction and who will then go to schools where they will not have the same protections as in public school. It just doesn't make sense. It's also not a great use of money. We already see SB 10 students, the children with IEPs who use the special needs scholarship, and Ms. Heck may have alluded to some of them, who return to our schools having been outside of them. And a lot of the schools that qualify for those students actually don't provide specialized instruction. They are just private schools. And they come back to the district and there are learning gaps. There's no accountability for the use of funds. There is no accountability for student achievement. And this proposed expansion comes at a time, as Ms. Morgan alluded to, when we're not fully funding public schools again. We had so much progress with being fully funded before the pandemic. We need to at least get back to that point. Now on to my specific concerns. And forgive me, these are gonna feel legal. Despite these many global concerns about this legislation, if you still move the bill forward, here are our specific concerns. On lines 75 to 79. The bill proposes that students only have to be enrolled in a public school for one FTE count. FTE counts occur on a day in October and March. Having a student for a single day does not allow a school district to educate a child. The district hasn't even had a chance to show that they can appropriately provide an education. And in fact, part of why the original law says a year is because we actually have 10 days if a child moves from out of state to move their IEP to a Georgia IEP. We couldn't even get that done in a day. Second, lines 93 and 94 read, the student has a formal diagnosis from a licensed physician or psychologist or a Section 504 plan. So a student who had leukemia when he was 2 and has a formal diagnosis can now get a special needs scholarship as a perfectly healthy 15-year-old. That's what that language allows. The diagnosis requirements need a time frame, at the very least. We suggest the last calendar year. And licensing requirements. Right now, it just says licensed. They could be licensed from anywhere, including another country. We suggest licensing in the state of Georgia. Additionally, it should not be an either-or situation. It should be and. They need the diagnosis and a 504 plan. While 504 plans are significantly easier to get than an IEP, at least there would still have been some type of review by someone who's an educator. Just saying a student needs a diagnosis is not the same as requiring a plan. There are, in fact, many children who are protected by 504 plans who do not rise to the level of needing a 504. Protected by 504, but don't have plans. One can be 504 eligible, just like a child with an IEP. Every child with an IEP is 504 eligible. However, those children are served through an IEP. Some children are not served through an IEP or a 504 plan. They simply have the protections because there isn't an academic impact where they need a plan. On line 128, it should read accommodations and services as the bill reads earlier at line 16. On lines 144 and 146, don't understand why we're going to be covering uniforms and athletics when schools are not funded for uniforms and athletics. So that seems like an interesting stretch. On line 156, it reads, upon proper documentation. This line is the current law, which demonstrates the complete lack of accountability in the special needs scholarship or vouchers program. Proper documentation could be almost anything, and yet we hand funds over to families with almost no accountability for how they are used for education. Once they become eligible, they are eligible. So again, go back to the list of criteria. Are we going to say that a child who has something early on that actually manifests and that then we get under control and that we get their educational needs under control gets 17 years? Finally, if you're going to improve accountability, the last 3 paragraphs starting at line 188 could use a lot of tightening up. How does a parent survey show that voucher money is actually being used for children? There needs to be a true accounting of the return on investment of these funds, just like schools have accountability through CCRPI and GOSA. This proposed expansion is incredibly broad. There's no accountability for the use of funds. There's no tracking of student progress, and it just doesn't make sense. Thank you.
Next word from Jamie Lord, American Federation of Children and George Seneca.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, and thank you to Senator Gooch for bringing the bill. As you referenced, I represent 2 organizations that are supportive of this legislation, American Federation for Children and Georgia Center for Opportunity. And I worked with both of those organizations under different names before one went through a merger and one went through a name change back in 2007 when this law was created. So I've been around for a long time having these same discussions. And I remember at the time, a lot of these same concerns being raised. Just there will be too many kids participate, a mass exodus from public school, which will cripple the public schools financially and not allow them to serve the students that are left. It will be just unaccountable. Teachers will lose their jobs. We'll have to shutter special needs classrooms, et cetera. And I think what we've just seen over the last 14 years, and I know we were getting into some of the math earlier, but to Senator Brass's point, is at the end of the day, it's a very small number of people that participate. And here's why I think that's true, just based on a lot of the work that we've done talking with families over the last 14 years. It's because the vast majority of people are going to be best served where they are in public school. It is going to be cheaper and easier for a family to stay where they are, where they have transportation, where public school is free, and where they are under some sort of federally mandated protections and services. So for a family to get out of that and cost themselves something, certainly time to figure out somewhere where their child can go and be better served, transportation, if that's not provided, possibly even some out-of-pocket resources, as is the case a lot of times, then they really have a need. They are desperate to go somewhere else where their child can be better served. And so I think sort of where the organizations that I represent come to this conversation is just a recognition that our public schools do an amazing job, but we just cannot expect them to do the best for every single student. Every classroom is different. Even families that have more than one kid knows that those kids have different needs. And so what we're trying to do is not say that the special needs scholarship is going to benefit every child. It shouldn't, because every child is different. But nor can the public school system be the absolute best place for every student, especially students that have very specific and special needs, which is what this program was designed for. Over the 14 years that it's been in place, it has come to our attention that there are just students that have special needs and very specific circumstances that should have been covered initially, and just the way it was drafted, they didn't. Other states like ours have gone back and fixed this. That's what this bill attempts to do. I think we can reasonably assume that families that are going to take advantage of this program are families that just really need help and need an alternative, and it would very likely remain relatively small. So while a very small number of families may participate as a percentage of the overall student population in the state of Georgia, this program is life-changing for some of them. It absolutely means the world to that individual family, while I would argue the impact that we have seen, statewide and even system-wide is, negligible. In fact, I've not heard a single example in the, last decade or more of particular problems. It is true that sometimes kids leave the program and come back to public school. I see that as an ultimately probably a good thing. There are certain families that are needing to address a specific issue, and if it gets under control, their whole goal was to get students back to a traditional public school setting, because that's where they would prefer them to be. But they just needed something specific and specialized for a time. So I don't know that that's a failure of the program so much as just a goal for some families even going in. I think I'll stop there because I know we are short on time and the hour is late, but if there are questions, I'm happy to answer them. But I appreciate this committee being so thoughtful about this issue.
Thank you. Robert Buddy Costley.
Good afternoon, good evening. As the hour does get late, I do appreciate the important topic that all of you are taking on. I represent the Georgia Association of Educational Leaders, which is the umbrella organization for 7 different affiliate organizations: the Georgia School Superintendents Association, middle school principals, elementary school principals, secondary school principals, curriculum instructional supervisors, the Georgia Council for Administrators of Special Education, and of course the HR folks, the Human Resources, GASPA. So, as you know, and it won't surprise anyone that has any experience with Gale, we take a lot of pride in advocating for public education. We have a long-standing history of our board voting for legislative priorities that discourage the diversion of public taxpayer funds to private institutions. But we're here to talk about kids today. And I wanted to just share a few things, because sometimes that gets lost. Even in our own narrative, we'll talk about funding. Of course, everybody needs funding. Fire stations need funding. Law enforcement needs funding. We can't get away from it. I get it. But I do want to remind the committee when we speak, and it looks like sometimes we're against certain things and for certain things, that we are people that work in the schoolhouse every day, and we don't leave the children. We're in the hallways with the children. When they're crying, when they're laughing, we're serving them lunch, we're doing discipline, and we're meeting with their mamas and their daddies, oftentimes their grandparents. And all of you that have experience in our public schools know that. So here's why we are really concerned about this particular bill. This bill does a great job of expanding choice. That's one of the things that we're concerned about. It expands it so much it doesn't appear to be a whole lot of control. That may meet the objectives of the author, and I get it. We want to expand choice. If you're of that belief, there are 2 problems, however. We have often heard in these committees, and I've been coming to them for a few years now, we've often heard about the life-changing experiences that a kid can have in a private school in Georgia. And there is no doubt, I would never argue with that. There are some phenomenal private schools in this state that we could learn from. But that also means that there are private schools that are not phenomenal. That also means that there are private schools that need oversight. One thing I know is true, we talk about what is true a lot, I know is true is this Senate voted 52-0 last year for Senate Bill 68. Senate Bill 68, 52-0. That bill required every school board to increase their training on financial transparency. That bill required the Department of Education to create a template to guide so that the boards of education, every board of education in this state, would monthly report their fiscal activities. Why? Not for the department to look at, not for the Senate to look at, for the voters and the citizens of Georgia to look at. When we talk about fiscal transparency, and we're coming to the kids, there's a reason why, because we expect deliverables on public tax dollars, and every voter in Georgia has the right to know where their dollars are going so that they can hold their senator accountable, their superintendent, as I was, accountable, and so on, their board member accountable. It's not enough that the department gets to review a satisfaction survey. It's not enough, we feel, that the General Assembly gets the report. We feel like the voters of the state of Georgia, and I feel like you feel like that because you voted for Senate Bill 68 last year, 52-0. In fact, you felt so emphatically about that bill that the Senate, and I don't disagree with it, I mean, it's one that's been in charge of school budgets for a long, long time, is that you're rating school boards as high risk on their financial management. Why? Because how they use that money affects kids. How they use that money affects the families that bring those kids to school. It was important to you such that you voted 52-0. The irony in the bill, and we say this with all respect, because you can tell, I mean, we're emphatically against it, but why would we send hundreds of millions of dollars in the various scholarship organizations that we have in Georgia? And the fact is, we don't know what we're spending. We have not done a fiscal note. We could be voting the bill out to the chamber floor, and we don't have an idea of what it costs. But how could we do that and not know whether, what if some of those private school boards are not handling the money correctly? What if they have audit findings that the voters deserve to know about? We'll never know. Oh, the previous speaker just says, we haven't heard a whole lot about problems. And I said, exactly. Why not? We do hear about public school problems, though, because they have to post their laundry on every website in the state. You can look at it, every SPLOST dollar they spend. Second point, and I'm done, and I appreciate your listening ears. I feel like this bill fails the kids drastically. We have heard, and it probably does, it would give kids the opportunity to attend schools, perhaps, and provide choices that would benefit those individual children. But we're not checking on the kids. And to me, as a middle school principal, as a superintendent, that's what bothers us the most is how can we send that money to these private schools and not check on the kids? What if they are attending a private school that is not functioning as well, and we will never hear about it because we don't get to see their audit findings, we don't get to see their test scores. Even if they're higher function, we don't get to see if they grow from year to year. Maybe some department gets to see it, but not the voters. We're concerned that we're sending money and not checking on the kids, and we're not giving the voters the right to do what you've held us accountable for on Senate Bill 68. And with all due respect, we ask that in the age of austerity, when we need more counselors, mental health support, all of the emotional needs are about to walk in our schools as we recover from the pandemic, that we would love to see the narrative go to how can we help kids, all those ailing kids that are kind of suffering right now from the pandemic, and their parents are suffering. I appreciate you listening. I won't take any more of your time. I appreciate what you do because it is important. Thank you.
Thank you. Claire Suggs, Page.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and committee members. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with you this afternoon. And I frankly have the unenviable task of following great eloquence. So yes, my name is Claire Suggs, and I am here on behalf of PAGE, the Professional Association of Georgia Educators, and on behalf of the 95,000 educators across the state of Georgia who are working with our kids every day in public schools. Our members have consistently opposed private school vouchers, and they oppose Senate Bill 47, really for much of the same reasons that we've already heard discussed today. Our key concern is, of course, what is happening to children. As has already been described by Ms. Walton, the children to accept a scholarship under this program, they have to waive the rights that they have that are articulated in federal law, the right to the services that they need for the specific conditions that they have. And right now, we don't have, again, as has been articulated already, we don't have any information on what actually is the experience of children in the private schools. There has never been a comprehensive evaluation of this program, even though, as has been pointed out, it's 14 years old. And I think some of the conversations, some of the questions that have already come up today kind of point to that as a gap. You know, there are states that have undertaken longitudinal analysis and that can really tell us and tell voters and tell educators what have the experiences of the children have been. Do they return to public schools? Do they stay in private schools? What is the retention rate? What is the graduation rate? There's a lot we simply don't know about this program. And as already been pointed out, in addition to just the impact on children, we don't have good data on the financials of the participating private schools. Unlike public schools, which are audited every year, we simply don't have that information. We don't know how the funds are being used. So before there's any expansion of this program, we really need much more information and much more oversight. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
If you don't mind, Ms. Thank you. I was just reading the bill again, and I know we talked through some numbers of the potential pool of students for IEP 504 and SB 10. But I'm looking at line 93. It seemed, our earlier conversation seems a little off base or far too limited, because it also says you could, am I right, that you could just have a formal diagnosis from a physician or psychologist?
Yes.
So our whole conversation as it relates to who has how many 504s we have and IEPs is not really, it's somewhat relevant, but it's not
Well,
the
we don't
entire
know.
population.
Based
that we
on
would
this,
be.
I would assume we don't know the full scope of who might be eligible.
Thank you.
All right. Right now, we are well past the hour for this hearing, so I'm going to, we're just going to hold this and continue to come back to it and study this as we go forward. So I know there were some people signed up and didn't get to speak to this today, but we'll be sure to make sure that you're at the top of the list when we have this bill again. So since this is only hearing only, we'll go ahead and just call this meeting adjourned.